On a Saturday morning in June, at a regional off-road rally in the hill country outside Fredericksburg, Texas, a woman in a white Patagonia vest and $200 sunglasses looked at the truck in the staging lane beside her and laughed. Not the polite kind. The genuine kind, with the full posture of a person who did not feel the need to conceal what she found funny. The truck was a 1992 Ford F-150 with 314,000 miles on it. The paint had long since stopped being any single color, having lived through a quarter-century of Texas sun, 2 resprays by the previous owner, and a finish coat of dupli-color truck bed coating that the current owner had applied to the lower third of both doors to stop the rust migration without paying for a panel replacement. It had a roof rack made from 2-inch square steel tubing that the owner had welded himself. It had a winch. It had suspension components that did not match each other by manufacturer because the owner had sourced each corner for function rather than brand uniformity. It had, on its tailgate, a hand-painted number 47 in White House paint. The woman's truck was a 2024 Ram 2500 power wagon, factory lifted, in hydro blue pearl with a full Warren Industries winch package, a set of Fox Racing 2.5 Performance Series shocks at all 4 corners, and a vinyl wrap on the doors that said Callaway Off-Road with a logo she had commissioned from a design firm in Austin for $4,000. It was, by the objective measure of manufacturer's suggested retail price, a $78,000 vehicle. It was also, by the objective measure of the hill country terrain in front of them, the favorite to win the B-class field. The man in the $500 truck was named Cody Harlan. He was 38 years old. He had a 9-year-old daughter named June sitting in the passenger seat eating a breakfast taco from the Valero on Highway 87 that Cody had stopped at 40 minutes earlier. June had mustard on her shirt. She did not appear concerned about this. Cody looked at the woman in the white vest looking at his truck. He looked at his truck. He looked back at the woman. He said, "Something funny," she said through the laugh that had not fully subsided. "That is either the bravest or the least self-aware vehicle in this staging lane." He said, "Number 47, Cody Harlan, pleased to meet you." She looked at him properly then. She said, "Renata Callaway." She was still amused. "I'll see you out there," he said, "count on it." June said from the passenger seat, without looking up from the breakfast taco, "She's going to regret that." Cody did not say anything to that, because honestly it was a fair assessment from a 9-year-old who had been watching him build that truck for 4 years. 14 miles of hill country trail, and 5 hours later, number 47 crossed the finish line first in the B-class field by 11 minutes and 23 seconds. The 2024 Ram 2500 power wagon finished third. Renata Callaway was standing at the finish when it happened, having arrived second, and she watched the F-150 come in with its mismatched suspension, and its rust-converted lower doors and its hand-painted number, and pulled up to the timing board with Cody's daughter June, standing on the running board holding the roll bar with both hands and her hair going in 6 directions from the trail wind and the mustard spot still on her shirt. Renata looked at the truck. She looked at Cody. She looked at the timing board. She said, "How?" It was not a question the way she said it. It was the beginning of a longer conversation. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this travels. Stay until the end because what Cody had built inside that truck was worth considerably more than what the truck had cost him. Cody Harlan had grown up in Kerrville, Texas, which sits in Kerr County in the eastern edge of the hill country, on the Guadalupe River, in the particular landscape of live oak and cedar and limestone that Texans from other parts of the state regarded as the good kind of Texas. The kind that had shade and water and topography rather than the flat, and the hot that stretched north and west from there in every direction for a very long time. His father, Ray Harlan, had run a small engine and fabrication shop on the south edge of town for 31 years. Not a restoration shop, not a specialty shop, a general fabrication and repair operation that did whatever came through the door. Farm equipment, ranch vehicles, custom metal work for contractors and homebuilders, the occasional specialty project for someone who needed something built that didn't exist in any catalog. Ray Harlan had been the kind of fabricator who believed that if you understood materials and load and geometry, you could build anything that was structurally sound, and who had proved this over 3 decades in ways that made his reputation in Kerr County essentially untouchable. Cody had been in that shop from the age he could reach a workbench standing flat-footed, which was 8, and had progressed from watching to handing tools to running the MIG welder under supervision, to running it unsupervised, and eventually, to the point where by the time he was 18 his welds were cleaner than his father's. which Ray had acknowledged without resentment because resentment about a child exceeding a parent in a skill that the parent had taught was the most counterproductive emotion a craftsman could entertain. Cody had not gone to college. This had not been a failure or a resignation. It had been a decision made at 17 with the clarity that some people found earlier than others. The work that made him whole was physical and mechanical and three-dimensional, and the path to doing it excellently went through doing it, not through 4 years of not doing it while accumulating a credential for something else. He had spent those 4 years working for a fabrication shop in San Antonio, one of 3 he had interviewed with, specifically because it did trailer builds and custom frame work and suspension modification at a volume that gave him more repetitions in those 4 years than most fabricators got in 10. He had come back to Kerrville when his father's health had required it. That was 10 years ago. He had been running the shop since then, not as a placeholder, but as the natural continuation of a thing that had his name on it, now in both the legal and the practical sense. He had bought the 1992 F-150 at an estate auction in Comfort, Texas, for $512. He had driven it the 14 miles back to Kerrville in second gear because the transmission was uncertain about third, and had parked it behind the shop and looked at it for 20 minutes with the particular attention of someone cataloging the distance between what a thing was and what it could become. The F-150 of this era used the 5-liter Windsor V8, the 302 cubic inch, which was one of the most documented and resourced engines in the history of American performance, because it was also the engine in the Fox body Mustang, and the Cobra and 100 other things that enthusiasts had been modifying since the 1980s. The knowledge base was enormous. The parts ecosystem was vast. The engine responded to modification in ways that were well understood and thoroughly documented because 40 years of people doing exactly what Cody was planning to do had generated a library of real-world data. He had spent 4 years on the truck. Not exclusively. He had a shop to run and a daughter to raise and a life that was full in both the demanding and the good meanings of the word. But the F-150 had been the consistent project in the background of those 4 years, progressing in the hours between the shop's last job and June's bedtime, and on Saturday mornings before June woke, and during the 3 weeks in January each year when Kerrville was too cold for comfortable outdoor work, and the shop's interior bay held everything he needed. What he had built was not immediately legible to someone looking at the outside of the truck. The outside looked like what it was, a 32-year-old working truck that had been maintained rather than pampered, kept functional rather than kept cosmetically. But the outside was not where the work had gone. The work had gone into the engine, which was now a fully rebuilt 5-liter Windsor with a Edelbrock Performer RPM air gap intake manifold, a Holley 40 160 750 CFM carburetor, a set of trick-flow twisted wedge 170cc cylinder heads, roller rockers, and a hydraulic roller camshaft from Comp Cams, the Extreme Energy 262 HR12, specifically, which Cody had chosen after reading every forum thread that existed about 5-liter street and mild off-road builds, and cross-referencing the cam specs against his target power band. The engine produced an estimated 310 horsepower at the flywheel, which in a truck that weighed 3,600 pounds with driver was a power-to-weight ratio that politely ignored what the truck looked like from the outside. The suspension was a long-travel setup built around a rough country 6-inch lift kit as the starting point, which Cody had then significantly modified. The front control arms were fabricated in-house from Dom tubing, drawn over mandrel, the clean structural tubing used in roll cages and chassis work, and gave him considerably more wheel travel than the stock arms the kit assumed. The rear was a custom leaf spring setup that he had designed himself, consulting with a spring manufacturer in San Antonio called Texas Hydraulics who had built springs to his specification. The shocks were Bilstein 5100 series at all 4 corners, valved specifically for the suspension geometry he had built rather than the stock geometry they were designed for, which required a phone call to Bilstein's tech line and a conversation with an engineer that Cody had found genuinely enjoyable. He had replaced the front differential with a Dana 44 unit from a 1990s Bronco found at a pull-apart in San Antonio for $230. He had rebuilt the transmission, a Mazda M5 Odd 5 Speed, with a kit from National Parts Depot that had cost him $412 and 12 hours of a Saturday. He had welded a 4-point roll cage inside the cab from 2-inch DOM tubing, not the full competitive specification. A street-legal reinforcement, the kind that would not save you from a severe rollover, but would save you from the kind of terrain incident that hill country trails occasionally produced. He had installed a Warren Industries VR-10S winch on the custom front bumper he had built from 3/16 plate steel. The total investment in parts and materials over 4 years was $11,400, which he had recorded in a notebook he kept in the shop office with the precision of a man who had been taught to account for everything that went into a job. The truck also had a feature that no invoice line item captured. June had painted the number 47 on the tailgate herself, with a 2-inch brush and a quart of Sherwin-Williams interior latex in ultra-white that they had found in the shop's paint storage. She had asked Cody what number she should use, and he had said, "Pick one you like." She had said 47 because she had been 7 when they started the project, and she liked the idea of leaving a record of when it began. He had not repainted it. Renata Calloway had built Calloway Off-Road over 11 years from a single-location Jeep accessories and lift shop in Austin into a 12-location chain across Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado that had revenues the previous year of $31 million, and a brand presence in the off-road community that her marketing director described as aspirational, and that Renata described as earned. The distinction between those two characterizations being the primary source of creative tension between them and the reason the marketing was as good as it was. She was 46 years old. She had grown up in Laredo, the daughter of a truck dealer and a civil engineer, and had absorbed from both parents a specific relationship with vehicles that was professional rather than merely recreational. They were tools with economic logic, and the person who understood that logic better than anyone else in the room had an advantage that most people around them didn't recognize until it was too late. She had started Calloway Off-Road after 10 years in automotive retail, specifically in the aftermarket accessories segment, where she had developed such a comprehensive understanding of both the product side and the customer side that going independent had felt less like a leap than a logical next step that had been obvious for years and taken longer than it should have because she was cautious in the way of people who had been raised by a civil engineer and had internalized the load-bearing capacity analysis before acting on any structure. She was divorced, competently and without drama, 4 years ago from a man named David who was in commercial real estate and who was, in every relevant dimension, a good person and a poor match, and who had agreed with her assessment of this situation at approximately the same moment she had, which had made the ending clean if not painless. She had a 16-year-old son named Marcus who lived primarily with her in Austin and who was interested in exactly 2 things: competitive debate and electric guitar, neither of which had any connection to the off-road industry, which Renata found both mildly funny and entirely correct. She competed in regional off-road rallies because she sold products to people who competed in regional off-road rallies, and the most credible thing she had ever done for her brand was win events rather than merely sponsor them. She had won 6 regional events in 5 years. She was legitimately good at it, not professional circuit good, but good enough that the people in the regional community who tracked such things knew her name for her driving rather than for her business. The Ram 2500 Power Wagon was new this season. She had spec'd it herself, which meant she had gone through the Fox Racing 2.5 shock options with the Fox Racing tech rep in detail, and had chosen the specific valving for the hill country terrain profile she knew from 7 years of competing in this region. The Warren Industries Xeon 12S winch she had ordered directly and installed herself over a Saturday afternoon, because installing equipment she sold was not optional if she was going to have any credibility talking about its installation. She had laughed at the F-150 because the outside of it was, by the measurable standards that the off-road market used to assess capability, a joke. The suspension geometry was not immediately legible. Body condition was not immediately legible. The only thing that was immediately legible was the number 47 in-house paint on the tailgate, which was either artisanal or unserious, and from the staging lane she had no way to determine which. She had been wrong before. She was not accustomed to being wrong in this specific context, which was why the staging lane laugh had been genuine rather than strategic. You did not strategically laugh at things you were uncertain about. You laughed when you were sure. She had been sure. By mile 4 of the 14-mile course, when she could see the F-150's roof rack disappearing over a limestone ridge a significant distance ahead of her, She began the process of revising her certainty with the specific focus of a person who had been wrong and was not going to remain wrong longer than the evidence required. The Fredericksburg Hill Country Rally ran a 14-mile course that its organizers had refined over 9 years into something that rewarded mechanical preparation over raw power and tactical intelligence over speed. The terrain was limestone outcrop, cedar break, dry creek crossings, and 2 significant climbs. The first at mile 3, a quarter-mile ascent over loose shale that exposed any weakness in suspension articulation and power delivery simultaneously, and the second at mile 11, a longer sustained climb over packed caliche that separated vehicles with correct gear ratios from those with impressive horsepower but insufficient torque at low speed. There were 3 water crossings. The deepest was at mile 8, a seasonal creek that in June ran about 16 inches over a rock-strewn bottom, sufficient to test both approach angle and the driver's judgment about momentum versus control. The course did not reward the truck with the most expensive suspension or the newest equipment. It rewarded the truck that was set up correctly for this specific terrain and driven by someone who had done the analytical work beforehand. Cody had driven this course 3 times in previous years in a borrowed Jeep Cherokee and once in a friend's Toyota Tacoma. He had noted over those 4 runs 3 specific places where most drivers lost time. The shale climb at mile 3, where wheels spin from too much power to early turned a manageable surface into a skating rink. The switchback descent at mile 6, where the instinct to brake was counterproductive, and the correct input was throttle and controlled weight transfer. And the rock garden at mile 10, a 300-yard section of exposed limestone that required not speed, but the willingness to let the suspension work without driver interference. He had driven the course in his head on the 40-minute drive from Kerrville to Fredericksburg that morning, while June slept in the passenger seat with her head against the window and the breakfast taco bag on her lap. He had rehearsed the 3 specific problem sections. He had identified his braking points and his power application points as precisely as he could from memory of 4 previous runs in vehicles that were not this one. The F-150 was different from the Jeep and the Tacoma in 2 significant ways that worked in his favor. The engine's power band, the Comp Cam's hydraulic roller cam, was optimized for a range of approximately 2,000 to 5,500 RPM. Gave him a broad, usable torque curve that meant he was not hunting for a narrow RPM window to stay in. And the custom suspension travel, the longest in the B-class field by a margin he estimated at roughly 3 inches on each axle, meant the truck was able to keep all 4 wheels on the ground across terrain where shorter travel setups would momentarily lose contact and lose traction. He staged. The flag dropped. He drove the shale climb at mile 3 at 50% of the throttle he felt, which was less than his instinct wanted, and exactly what the surface required. The rear wheels found traction on the shale because he gave them traction to find rather than demanding more than the surface could give. He watched in his mirror as 3 vehicles behind him broke loose and recovered, and one broke loose and did not fully recover before the top. At the switchback at mile 6, he did not brake where everyone else braked. He transferred weight forward with a brief, deliberate throttle input and let the front tires load up into the corner, which was the input the geometry needed and which looked wrong from the outside, but felt exactly correct from the seat. He came out of the switchback 3 seconds faster than he had estimated. At the rock garden at mile 10, he slowed to a pace that looked, from any following vehicle's perspective, like a conservative driver who didn't trust his equipment. He was not being conservative. He was doing something harder than going fast, which was going the correct speed, the speed at which the suspension could work through each obstacle without driver interference, and without losing the line he had identified through the garden on his previous runs. He crossed the finish line at 5 hours and 14 minutes. The next vehicle crossed at 5 hours and 25 minutes. Renata Calloway's Ram Power wagon crossed at 5 hours and 32 minutes. June was standing on the running board at the finish because she had been standing on the running board for the last 2 miles, having moved there when she could see the finish flags through the trees, and having demonstrated her father's characteristic stubbornness about physical positions, she had decided on by refusing to move back inside when Cody told her to 3 times, and succeeding on the 4th attempt, which was a familiar negotiation in their household. Renata got out of the Ram and walked to the timing board and stood there looking at the numbers for a long moment. She said to nobody in particular, 11 minutes. Cody said, 23 seconds. She turned around. He was leaning against the F-150 with a bottle of water, not performing anything, just standing in the finish of a thing that had gone the way he had prepared it to go. She said, 11 minutes and 23 seconds. He said, yes. She looked at the truck. She said, how? He said, which part? She said, all of it. He said, that's a longer conversation. She said, I have time. June appeared at Cody's elbow with the water bottle she had produced from the truck's cooler and handed it to Renata without saying anything, which was her way of deciding someone was acceptable, and which Renata received with the direct, unperformed thank you of someone who did not condescend to children. He said, there's a diner in Fredericksburg. Best migas in the hill country, buy you breakfast and I'll explain the truck. She said, lunch, it's 1:15. He said, best migas in the hill country regardless of the time. She said, one condition. He said, what? She said, start with the suspension. The diner was the Fredericksburg Pie Company on South Adams Street, which did not have the best migas in the hill country, but did have very good ones, and more relevantly had booths large enough for 3 people and a person with an exhibit, which was what Cody became approximately 6 minutes into the conversation when he pulled his phone out and began showing Renata photographs. He showed her the suspension build in sequence. Not because he had prepared this as a presentation. The photographs existed in his phone because he had been documenting the build for 4 years as a personal record, the same impulse that had led his father to keep job logs for every project the shop touched. The photographs were ordered by date, and they told the story of the build the way any well-documented project told its story, component by component, decision by decision. Renata looked at them with the attention of someone for whom the technical content was not abstract. She ran 12 locations that did suspension and lift work. She had watched thousands of trucks get modified. She knew what good suspension fabrication looked like and what it didn't, and the photographs of the F-150's front control arms, the dom tubing, the weld quality, the geometry visible in the before and after wheel well clearance measurements were in the top tier of what she had seen at any price point. She said, you fabricated these in-house. He said, my shop in Careville. I run a fabrication and repair operation. She said, dom tubing. He said, 1 3/4 inch wall, overkill for a truck this weight, but I wasn't building to minimum spec. She said, what's the wheel travel front and rear? He said, 14 inches front, 12 rear. I gave up 2 inches of rear travel to keep the rear driveshaft angle in a range that didn't require a new shaft. She said, smart. Most builders take all the travel they can get and then chase driveshaft vibration for 2 years. He said driveshaft vibration at speed costs more time than the extra travel saves. She said, on paper. He said, on this course, I've run it 4 times, I know where the speed is. She looked at him over the coffee cup. She said, you've run this course before. He said, 3 times in borrowed vehicles, once in a friend's Tacoma. I've been studying this course while I built the truck. She said, for how long? He said, 3 years. The truck took 4. The first year I was still figuring out what I was building toward. She set her coffee down. She said, you built a truck over 4 years with a specific 14-mile course in mind. He said, among other courses, but this one is the regional benchmark. If the truck is right for this course, it's right for everything in the region. She looked out the diner window at the Fredericksburg Main Street, the Saturday tourists and the limestone storefronts and the German heritage architecture that Fredericksburg maintained with the specific civic pride of a place that understood its identity was also its economy. Then she looked back at him. She said, tell me about the engine. He told her. The Windsor Rebuild, the Edelbrock Performer RPM air gap intake, the Holly 4160, the Trick flow heads, the Comp Cam's hydraulic roller. He explained the cam selection specifically, the Extreme Energy 262 HR12, and why he had chosen it over the more aggressive options, which came down to the same principle as the drive shaft angle decision. Taking more than the application needed was not a performance advantage, it was a problem in disguise. She said the 262 HR12 has an intake duration of 217 at 50 thousandths. That's a mild street cam. He looked at her. He said, you know cam specs. She said, I sell performance parts. I either know them or I have no credibility. A pause. Most of my customers ordering the 262 HR12 are daily drivers who want a sound improvement. Why does a rally truck want a daily driver cam? He said, because this course is between 5 and 15 miles per hour at technical sections and 40 miles per hour at the top of the sustained climbs. The power band I need is 2,000 to 4,000 RPM for 90% of the run. An aggressive cam with a high lobe separation angle pushes the power band up into 4 to 6,000, more impressive on a dyno, less useful on this course. She said, you dynoed it. He said, Last October at a shop in San Antonio. 311 at the flywheel, 284 at the rear wheels. The torque curve is flat from 2200 to 4200. That's exactly where I need it. She was quiet for a moment. June was at the counter speaking to the server about pie options with the seriousness she applied to food decisions, which was the same seriousness she applied to most decisions. Renata said, "What did you pay for this course result?" He said $11,912 in parts and materials over 4 years, plus the $512 for the truck. She said, "You know it to the dollar." He said, "I keep records." She said, "I sell complete lift packages that do less than what you built for $12,000 and I start at $11,000 for the basic kit." He said, "You're selling labor and warranty and the convenience of a certified shop. That's worth something." She said, "Not 11 minutes and 23 seconds worth." He said, "That's the course knowledge and the cam selection and the driveshaft compromise and 3 years of thinking about this specific 14 miles. The parts are a small part of it." She looked at him steadily. She said, "Most people who know what you know don't end up in a $300 parts truck at a regional rally." He said, "The shop pays the bills. The truck is the education." She said, 4 years of education." He said, ongoing, "The truck isn't done." She said, "What's left?" He pulled the notebook from his jacket pocket. It was a Write in the Rain all-weather notebook in tan, the kind with the waterproof paper used by people who worked outdoors and could not have their records destroyed by a rain shower or a spilled coffee. He had been using Write in the Rain notebooks since his father had given him his first one at 14 with the instruction to write down everything he did to any machine he touched because the record was part of the work. He opened it to a page about 3/4 through and turned it so she could read it. The page listed in his handwriting 7 items under the heading Next Phase. She read them. She looked up. She said, "A coilover conversion." He said, "The Bilstein 5100s are good, but they're not adjustable. I want the ability to tune damping for different terrain profiles. King Coilovers makes a 2.5-inch diameter coilover with remote reservoir that works with my control arm geometry. I've spoken to their tech line." She said, "King Coilovers for a $500 truck." He said, "They're not for the truck. They're for the suspension geometry I built. The truck is the platform. The geometry is what I'm investing in." She looked at him. She said that sentence back to herself without saying it aloud. "The truck is the platform. The geometry is what I'm investing in." She thought about that for a moment that was longer than the previous ones. June returned from the counter with the information that the diner had a peach pie made that morning and that she had determined this to be the best available option and had ordered 3 slices. Cody had not been asked. He did not protest because June's food decisions were reliable and he trusted them more than his own. Renata said, "You didn't ask your dad." June said, "He would have said yes." Renata said, "How do you know?" June said, "Because it's peach pie and we just finished the course and he's going to want pie." Cody said, "She's correct." Renata said to June, "How long have you been coming to the rallies?" June said, "All of them. I was 6 at the first one. I watched from the trailer because I was too small for the roll cage. Now I'm the co-navigator." Renata said, "You navigate?" June said, "I have the course map. Dad memorizes it, but I call the terrain transitions so he doesn't have to split his attention." Renata said, "You were calling terrain transitions." June said, "Limestone outcrop at 200 meters, switchback right, long shale approach. That kind of thing." Renata looked at Cody. He said, "She started doing it without being asked." Third rally 2 years ago. She had been studying the course map in the truck on the way down. I heard her voice calling the approach to the mile 3 climb and I realized she was right and I was already responding to it. Renata said to June, "How do you learn the map?" June said, "I trace it on graph paper first, then I memorize it in sections, then I put the sections together." She paused. "Dad taught me that. He says if you understand the pieces, you understand the whole thing." Renata said, "Did he teach you anything else?" June thought about this with the seriousness she applied to fair questions. She said, "He taught me that the truck doesn't know what it cost, it only knows what you put into it." Renata was quiet for a moment. The pie arrived. It was good pie. She said, "How old are you?" June said, 9. I'll be 10 in September." Renata said, "What are you going to do when you're older?" June said, "Compete." Renata said, "In off-road rally." June said, "In whatever I'm good at." "But yes, probably off-road to start." She ate a bite of pie. "I'm already faster than most of the adults on the practice course at home. Dad times me." Cody said, "She is." Renata looked at the 9-year-old and thought about the 16-year-old back in Austin, whose interests were competitive debate and electric guitar, and who had never shown any interest in the business that had funded his entire existence, and who she had been entirely at peace with for 4 years, and only occasionally thought about from the perspective of a person who had built something and wondered who, if anyone, was going to carry it forward. She said, I have a practice course at my facility in Dripping Springs, 12 acres, better terrain variety than anything around here. I run junior development events 3 times a year. June looked at her, then at her father, then back at Renata. She said, can I come? Renata said, you'd need a guardian present and you'd need to be 10 for the junior classification. June said, I'll be 10 in September. Renata said, the next junior event is October. June looked at Cody with an expression that had no ambiguity in it. He said, we'll think about it. June said, that means yes. Renata said, your dad and I will discuss it. June said, that also means yes. She went back to the pie with the satisfaction of someone who had navigated a terrain transition and found the correct line. After June had finished her pie and announced that she was going across the street to look at the rock shop that had claimed, via a hand-lettered sidewalk sign, to have the best geodes in the hill country, a claim June intended to evaluate personally, Renata and Cody sat in the booth for another 40 minutes with coffee that had been refilled twice. She said, I want to ask you something and I want you to answer it honestly even if the honest answer is no. He said, all right. She said, my shops do good lift work. They do it to spec and they're certified and my customer satisfaction numbers are strong. But what I watched today and what I've been looking at in those photographs is a different level of work. The control arm fabrication, the spring design, the decision-making about what to compromise and what not to, that's not something I can train into a shop technician in a reasonable time frame. He said, it takes years. She said, I know it takes years. I've been trying to solve the problem for 2. She looked at the window. I have customers who want what you built, not truck builds specifically, custom fabrication for specific applications, competition builds, high-stakes builds where the customer has a specific goal and needs someone who will build toward that goal rather than toward a price point. He said, you want to offer custom fabrication. She said, I want to offer what you did to that truck. I want to be able to tell a customer who has a specific course, a specific terrain profile, a specific competitive objective that I have a person who will study those variables the way you studied this 14 miles and build something that addresses them directly. He said, you want to hire me. She said, I want to work with you. There's a difference. She turned her coffee cup on the table. I'm not looking for an employee. I have 140 employees. I'm looking for a partnership on a specific service category. You'd operate out of your shop in Kerrville. The builds would come to you. I'd handle the customer acquisition and the contract structure. You'd handle the technical work. He said, my shop is set up for fabrication and general repair. I don't have the square footage for multiple concurrent major builds. She said, how much would you need? He said, to run 2 concurrent builds at the level you're describing, I need a second bay, a dedicated welding station, and a lift. The current shop has 1 bay and 1 lift. Expanding the building would cost somewhere between $80,000 and $100,000 depending on what's involved with the slab. She said, I'll fund the expansion. He said, in exchange for what? She said, exclusivity on the custom build referrals. All Callaway customer builds that exceed the standard lift package scope come to you. You use Callaway-sourced parts where they're available at fair market. You put the Callaway name on the finished build sheets. She paused. And you run the truck at Callaway-sponsored events. That's worth more to me than the expansion cost. He said, the truck as a demonstration vehicle. She said, the truck as proof of concept. Every customer who is considering a $10,000 custom build wants to see what $10,000 looks like in actual competition. Your truck is that proof. It just beat $78,000 by 11 minutes and 23 seconds. He said, the truck won because of course knowledge and decision-making, not just because of the build. She said, I know. That's also part of what I'm proposing you bring to the customers. She looked at him directly. You're a teacher. The notebook, the documentation, the 4 years of recorded decisions, that's not just mechanical work. That's a methodology. I want my customers to have access to that methodology. He said, I've never taught formally. She said, you've been teaching your daughter for 4 years. On the basis of this afternoon's evidence, the results are exceptional. He looked out the window. June was visible across the street, holding something up to the rock shop window to see it against the light, which was either a geode or a piece of quartz, and from this distance Cody could not tell which. He said, I need to think about it. She said, of course. He said, and I need my attorney to look at whatever you put together. She said, that's the right answer. I'd be concerned if you said anything else. He said, how much time do you need to put together a term sheet? She said, a week. He said, I'll be at the shop. Ray Harlan had died 18 months before the Fredericksburg rally, in the November of the year when the hill country had had the early frost that killed half the cedar. He had been 67, which was not old by any measure that Cody found acceptable, and which the coronary event that had taken him had not consulted before acting. The 11 months between the diagnosis of the underlying condition and the final morning had been the kind of 11 months that reorganized a person. And Cody had come out the other side of them, a different version of himself than had gone in. Not a worse version, not a more limited version, but a version that understood some things more completely than he had before and carried that understanding the way all costly understanding was carried, as something that could not be set down. Ray had spent those 11 months with the particular quality of a man who had decided that the time was his to use rather than to grieve with. He had worked in the shop on the days he was able. He had sat in the shop on the days he was not, on a stool he had occupied for 30 years, watching Cody work and offering commentary that was sometimes technical and sometimes historical and occasionally philosophical in the way of a man who had been thinking about the same questions for 3 decades and was arriving at conclusions. He had said in one of those shop conversations something that Cody had written in the Write in the Rain notebook the same evening. The difference between a craftsman and a tradesman is that a tradesman knows how to do the job and a craftsman knows why. The tradesman finishes the job. The craftsman finishes it correctly. They are not the same thing and they never will be, and the market will always pay more for the tradesman because the market moves faster than it understands things. Cody had asked what a person was supposed to do with that. Ray had said, keep records, build things right, trust that eventually the right customer is in front of you and you have something real to show them. He had also said in a different conversation on a different day, don't confuse what you paid for something with what it's worth. The price you paid is history. The worth is what you decide to put into it from here. Cody thought about that sentence a great deal in the week following the Fredericksburg rally. He thought about it when he was in the shop on the Dana 44 front differential rebuild he had taken in from a customer, and when he was doing June's school pickup, and when he was sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings with the term sheet Renata had sent by email on Thursday, 14 pages, clean, the product of a business attorney who knew what they were doing. He had called his own attorney, a woman named Pauline Reyes in Kerrville who had handled the shop's incorporation and his property deed and his will, and who had reviewed the term sheet over 2 days and called him with questions and then with her assessment. The assessment was that the terms were fair, the exclusivity clause was the thing to negotiate, and that the expansion funding structure as written was a loan with favorable terms rather than a grant, which was correct and which he had expected and which he was comfortable with. He had sent 2 revisions back through Pauline. The exclusivity was modified to cover a specific class of build rather than all custom work, which meant he retained the right to take on custom projects that came through his own customers without the Callaway referral mechanism. Renata had accepted this revision in 12 hours. The second revision was a clause specifying that his name appeared on all build documentation, not just the Callaway name, his name, Harlan Fabrication, and that any marketing materials featuring the F-150 identified the builder. Renata had accepted this in 4 hours. He had signed on a Wednesday morning at the shop table with June watching from the doorway because she had come home from school to find his truck in the lot and had correctly deduced that something was happening. She said, "Did you sign it?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Is that good?" He said, "I think so." She said, "Is Renata going to come to the shop?" He said, "Yes, next week to discuss the expansion plans." June processed this. She said, "Did you tell her I want to come to the October junior event?" He said, "That's part of the agreement." She said, "What do you mean it's part of the agreement?" He said, "I included a provision that any junior competitive events at Callaway facilities are open to the families of partnership participants." June looked at him. She said, "You put me in the contract." He said, "I put the October event in the contract." She said, "That's the same thing." He said, "Drink your juice." She drank her juice. But she was smiling at the table in the way she smiled when something had gone exactly the way she had decided it was supposed to go. Renata arrived in Kerrville on a Tuesday morning in a dark blue Jeep Gladiator that was identifiably not stock, but was less identifiably from any particular build shop, which meant it was the personal vehicle rather than the demonstration vehicle. She arrived at 9, which Cody had noted in his previous interactions with her was her consistent pattern, 5 minutes early to anything that mattered. He showed her the shop. Not as a sales presentation. There was nothing to sell, the agreement was already signed, but because she had asked to see it, and he believed that a business relationship built on a foundation that either party had not fully inspected was a relationship built on assumption rather than knowledge. She looked at the Bridgeport knee mill that occupied the northeast corner of the shop, a 1978 model that had been reground and ray-leveled, and had DRO scales added. which put its practical accuracy within a few thousandths across its travel, and which had been the machine on which Cody had cut the control arm profiles for the F-150. She looked at the Lincoln Electric Square Wave TIG 200 welder and the Miller-Matic 252 MIG unit on the welding station. She looked at the rotary table mounted on the Bridgeport and understood from its presence that Cody was doing work that required circular interpolation, which was above the capability threshold of most small fabrication shops. She said, "The rotary table." He said, "I make my own tube adapters and spherical bearing housings. Standard off-the-shelf joints don't match the geometry I'm building to on custom applications." She said, "You're machining custom spherical bearing housings," he said, "when the application requires it." She stood in the middle of the shop and looked at it in the way she had looked at the F-150 at the finish line, with the recalibration expression, the specific quality of someone who had updated an assessment significantly upward from where it had started. She said, "The expansion I'm funding isn't going to be enough for what this shop could become." He said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I was thinking about a second bay and a lift. Looking at this, I think we should talk about a proper CNC conversion for the Bridgeport and a dedicated metrology area." He said, "That's a different conversation than what we signed." She said, "Yes, but it's the right conversation." He said, "Let me finish the first year under the agreement we have and see what the volume looks like before I take on more expansion than I can staff." She said, "Fair." She looked at the shop one more time. "Your father built this." He said, "He started it. I've added to it over 10 years. She said, "The machines are his originals." He said, "The Bridgeport is. He bought it in 1987 from a shop in San Antonio that was closing. It was 12 years old then." She said, "A 49-year-old Bridgeport holding thousandths." He said, "If you maintain the ways properly and regrind them when they drift, a Bridgeport holds its spec for a very long time. The machine knows what to do, you just have to keep it in the condition to do it." She said, "Like the truck." He said, "Like the truck." She looked at the Bridgeport and then at him and said, "I want to show you the Dripping Springs facility before the October event. I want you to see what you're partnering with." He said, "When?" She said, "Whenever June has a day off school." He said, "You want June to come." She said, "I want the person who's going to be running that October course to see it beforehand." A pause. "She'll want to study the terrain. I'd rather she sees it in person than works from a map that doesn't capture the rock composition." Cody said nothing for a moment. He thought about the morning at the Fredericksburg staging lane, about the laugh that had come from certainty that had not included the relevant information. He thought about a person who updated quickly and specifically, who read term sheets in a week and accepted reasonable revisions in hours, who had taken one look at his shop and immediately expanded her understanding of what she had partnered with. He said, "Columbus Day is a school holiday." She said, "I'll have the facility staff ready." The Callaway Off-Road Training and Demonstration Facility in Dripping Springs was 12 acres on the edge of the Edwards Plateau, approximately 30 miles west of Austin, acquired by Renata 4 years earlier, and developed over 2 construction seasons into a purpose-built off-road training environment. It had a 5-acre technical course with terrain features that replicated the most challenging conditions across the regional competition circuit. A shale climb, a rock garden, water crossings fed by a recirculating pump, a 2-track caliche section, and a switchback descent that Renata had specifically engineered to replicate the Mile 6 section of the Fredericksburg course, which she had identified years earlier as the most time-differentiating feature on the circuit. It also had a 12-bay workshop, a fabrication area with 2 lifts and a welding station, a classroom that seated 25 for the instructional sessions Renata ran before every event, and a hospitality building with a covered porch that looked out over the technical course. They arrived on a Tuesday morning in October in Cody's F-150 because June had requested the F-150 specifically. Renata was waiting on the porch with coffee. June got out and walked immediately to the fence line of the technical course and stood looking at it with the focused attention she had applied to the rock shop geode and the course map and the term sheet that she had read over Cody's shoulder when he thought she was doing homework. She said, "The shale section is steeper than Fredericksburg." Renata said, "By about 8 degrees. It replicates the Blanco River rally section rather than Fredericksburg." June said, "That changes the throttle application point." Renata looked at Cody. He said, "She studies the rallies I've competed in, all of them." June said, "If the grade is 8 degrees steeper, the wheel spin onset comes earlier because the weight transfer is more aggressive. You need to apply throttle later than you would at Fredericksburg." Renata said, "That's correct." June said, "How much later?" Renata said, "That depends on the vehicle and the surface condition. Why don't we walk it?" They walked the course for 2 hours. June walked every section with the systematic attention of someone building a mental map, which Cody had learned years ago was a literal description rather than a figure of speech. She asked precise questions about surface composition, about the drainage pattern that affected moisture content, about the rock garden's lithology. She used the word lithology, which she had encountered in a geology unit at school, and which she had retained because it was useful. Renata answered every question fully. She did not simplify. She did not say, "Come back when you're older." She spoke to June the way she spoke to adult drivers she was preparing for competition, which was to say she gave the relevant technical information and trusted the recipient to do something useful with it. By the time they reached the switchback descent, the Mile 6 replica, June had established a rapport with Renata that was audibly different from the diner conversation. Not warmer, more technical. More equal in the way that two people who are talking about the same subject at the same level were equal regardless of their respective ages. June said at the switchback, "You built this to replicate Mile 6 at Fredericksburg." Renata said, "Yes." June said, "Because that's where your dad won the most time this year." Renata stopped. She looked at June. She said, "My father drove a rally." June said, "Not your father. I meant because that's where we won the most time, Dad, at Fredericksburg." Renata said, "The switchback was where your dad gained the most on the field." June said, 4 minutes and 18 seconds on the switchback alone according to the split times. I looked them up." Renata said, "You looked up the split times." June said, "They post them on the rally website. It's public information." Renata looked at Cody, who was standing slightly behind June with an expression of familial composure, which was the expression of a parent who has long since accepted that their child was going to be what they were going to be and had decided that the appropriate response was support rather than moderation. She said, "She looked up the split times." He said, "She looks up everything." Renata said, "The switchback section is where we run the junior development training. The technique instruction I do in the classroom corresponds to what they practice here." She looked at June. "Would you like to see the classroom?" June said yes before the sentence was finished. The classroom held the technical library Renata had assembled over 4 years, rally course maps from every event on the regional circuit, suspension specification sheets for 140 vehicle configurations, terrain analysis worksheets she had developed for the junior program, and on the front wall a whiteboard on which someone had drawn, in blue marker, the diagram of a vehicle weight transfer in a corner. June stood in front of the whiteboard and looked at the diagram. She said, "This is wrong." Renata said, "What do you mean?" June said, "The vector here." She pointed. "This is showing the center of gravity shifting toward the outside front wheel in a left-hand turn. But if the turn is combined with a downgrade of 8 degrees or more, the forward weight transfer from the grade partially counteracts the lateral transfer. The resultant vector should be more forward than this." She said it with the matter-of-fact tone of someone correcting a transcription error, not the combative tone of someone trying to establish a point. Renata looked at the diagram. She looked at June. She picked up the blue marker. She said, "Show me." June took the marker. She redrew the vector. Renata looked at the corrected diagram for a long time. Then she looked at Cody. He said, "She's been doing physics at school." Renata said, "She just corrected my training material." He said she probably learned it from the training material and then thought about it until she found the gap. Renata said to June, "Where did you get the training material?" June said, "The Callaway website has a resources section. I downloaded the Junior Driver Technical Guide." Renata said, "You downloaded our technical guide before I invited you here." June said, "You invited me in September. I downloaded it in July." She capped the marker and handed it back. "I thought I should be prepared." The October Junior Development event at Dripping Springs ran 12 competitors between the ages of 10 and 17. Each in a vehicle either they or their parent had built or significantly modified, each demonstrating across 3 timed sections, and a technical challenge, the skills that Renata's program defined as the foundation of safe and effective off-road competition. June turned 10 on September 11th. She had been 10 for 29 days when the October event ran. She competed in the F-150, which was not the smallest vehicle in the junior class. There was a teenage boy from San Marcos in a Suzuki Samurai that had been modified to the absolute limit of its platform, but was the oldest and the heaviest, and the one that most of the other junior competitors' parents looked at in the staging area with an expression that was a quieter version of the expression Renata had had at the Fredericksburg lane 4 months earlier. June drove the shale section at the correct throttle application point, which she had walked 3 times in the preceding weeks, and had diagrammed in the rain notebook Cody had given her for her birthday. A tan cover, the same model as his, which she had received with the specific delight of a person for whom the gift was exactly right. She drove the rock garden with the patience of someone who had studied it and trusted the suspension to do its work without her interference, which was the hardest lesson for most drivers at any age, and which June had apparently internalized somewhere between the classroom whiteboard and the 3-site walks. She drove the switchback with the weight transfer technique she had described in the classroom, which was 4 months ahead of when she could have learned it from any structured curriculum. She won the junior class by 3 minutes and 41 seconds. The margin would have been larger if she had not been docked 45 seconds on the technical challenge for a cone displacement in the cone navigation section, which she attributed to tire width rather than driver error, and about which she spoke to Cody in the debrief with the precision of a driver who had already identified the setup adjustment required. Renata gave out the results in the hospitality building afterward. She gave June the junior class trophy, which was a small fabricated metal representation of a lifted truck on a wooden base, and which June received with the composed expression of someone who had expected to be here and was now here. Renata said to the assembled parents and drivers, "The junior class result today was the widest margin I've seen in 4 years of running this event." The driver of number 47 made no significant errors in the timed sections and identified a setup improvement in the technical challenge debrief that I'm going to be thinking about. She's 10 years old. There was applause. June sat with the trophy on her knee and did not perform anything about it. After the event, while parents were loading vehicles and the facility staff were clearing cones, Renata found Cody at the fence line looking at the technical course. She said she told you about the cone displacement before the debrief. He said, she told me at the course exit, complete debrief section by section what she did correctly, what she would change. She said, she debriefs herself. He said, she learned it from the Write in the Rain notebook. She said, your father started that habit. He said, he started a lot of things. She said, how are you doing with that, with losing him? He said, better. The 18 months since have been, the shop is better for having had to be entirely mine. I understand it differently than when he was in it. She said, that's a hard way to understand something. He said, most of the important understandings are. She looked out at the course. She said, Thomas, my ex-husband, he was a structural engineer. When we were first building the Dripping Springs facility, he designed the drainage system. He spent 2 weeks on the drainage system for a 12-acre off-road course. She paused. I thought it was excessive. He said if the drainage was wrong, the terrain would be wrong in rain conditions, and the terrain being wrong in rain conditions was a safety issue. He was right. The drainage has been perfect for 4 years. Cody said, 2 weeks for a drainage system. She said, he said the same thing you said about the cam selection. He said taking more time than the average person would think reasonable was not excessive. It was correct. Cody said, your ex-husband sounds like someone I'd like. She said, he'd have liked the F-150. He would have understood it immediately. A pause. He moved to Portland 2 years ago. He's building bridges. He's happy. Cody said, that's a good outcome. She said, yes. She looked at the course again. I was thinking this morning about the staging lane in June. The laugh. He said, you don't need to, she said. I do, actually. Not as an apology. I apologized at the diner, and that was genuine, but as a professional observation. She turned to look at him. I've been in this industry for 20 years. I've looked at 1,000 trucks and assessed them in 15 seconds. The assessment has been correct often enough that I trusted it too completely. What the F-150 looked like from the outside was an accurate description of a truck nobody had put anything into. What it actually was a truck that someone had put everything into in the places that don't show. He said, it's a reasonable assessment failure. The outside was genuinely bad. She said, the outside was also irrelevant. That's the failure. I assessed the thing I could see and missed the thing that mattered. A pause. I do that in business sometimes. I assess the visible and miss the structural. He said, everyone does. She said, you don't. He said, I have a different failure. I see the structural and miss the visible. I let the outside of the truck sit for 4 years while I put everything into the components. She said, that's a less costly failure in the long run. He said, not if you're in the staging lane and someone in a white vest is laughing at you. She made the sound that was half laugh and half admission. He had been recognizing it as the sound she made when something landed correctly, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. She said, fair. The expansion of the Harlan fabrication shop was completed in January, 4 months after the October event. The new bay was 24 feet by 36, the slab reinforced for a 2-post lift, the welding station relocated to give the new space a dedicated light-duty fabrication area with its own ventilation. The lift was a Bend Pack XBR-10 2-post unit, rated for 10,000 pounds, chosen because it had the drive-through width necessary for the long wheelbase vehicles that custom builds typically involved. The first Callaway-referred custom build arrived in February. A 2021 Ford Bronco belonging to a software developer from Austin named Derek Wynn, who competed in the Southwest Regional Circuit, and who had been quoted a higher price by two other shops for a coilover conversion and long travel arm build, and who Renata had redirected after reading his build specification and recognizing that it was the exact application the partnership was designed for. Cody spent 4 days with Derek before he touched the Bronco. The 4 days were conversation and measurement and terrain analysis. He drove with Derek to the 3 courses on the circuit that Derek competed on and walked each one. He asked Derek questions that Derek had not expected. Not what do you want the truck to do, which every builder asked, but what has the truck done wrong in specific sections of specific courses, which was the question that surfaced the actual problem rather than the sim. The actual problem on Derek's Bronco was not the coilover specification. It was the rear sway bar setup interacting with the current suspension geometry in a way that was creating unpredictable oversteer in fast corners with a camber change. The coilovers Derek wanted would not fix this. The coilovers, in fact, would make it worse because they would increase the wheel travel that was amplifying the problem. Cody wrote this up in the Write in the Rain notebook and then typed it into a formal analysis document that he sent to Derek before they discussed the build scope. He included the diagnosis, the proposed solution, the alternative solution, and the cost differential between them. He included the course-specific performance prediction for each option based on his terrain walk data. Derek called him 2 hours after receiving the document and said he had been told by the 2 previous shops that he needed a coilover upgrade. Cody said, "You might need a coilover upgrade eventually. You currently need a sway bar geometry correction and array rate of the rear springs. That's $3,000, not $12. If you do it correctly, you can add the coilovers next season and they'll work properly because the geometry is already correct." Derek said, "You're telling me to spend less money." Cody said, "I'm telling you to spend money on the right thing first." Derek said, "The other shops didn't do a terrain analysis." Cody said, "The terrain analysis is the job, the parts come after." Derek authorized the correct work. He competed 2 months later and improved his personal best on the Blanco River course by 6 minutes and 40 seconds, which he reported to Cody via text at the finish line with a level of enthusiasm that Cody noted in the customer file as exceptional, and that Renata noted when Derek mentioned it to her at the next Callaway event as exactly the kind of outcome that justified the partnership. She called Cody that evening. She said Derek Wynn improved his Blanco personal best by 6 minutes. He said, 40 seconds, 6 and 40. She said, he told everyone at the event. He said you diagnosed a problem 2 shops had missed. He said 2 shops gave him what he asked for. I gave him what he needed. She said, that's going to be a problem for you eventually. He said, how so? She said, because word of this builds faster than you can staff for it. I've seen this happen in this industry. The builder who actually solves problems rather than executes requests becomes oversubscribed in about 18 months. He said, then I'll have to make decisions about what I take on. She said, you'll need to hire. He said, not yet. I'm not hiring until the quality of the work requires it rather than the volume. She said, the volume is going to require it first. He said, then I'll decline work. She was quiet for a moment. She said, most people don't decline work when the volume arrives. He said, most people didn't take 4 years to build a truck before they entered a race. She said, no, they didn't. A pause. How's the F-150? He said, the King coilover conversion starts next week. She said, King 2.5 with remote reservoir. He said, I spoke to their tech line again. I sent them the control arm geometry drawings. They valved the coilovers to my specification. She said, they valved to your geometry. He said, I sent them the suspension travel data from the Fredericksburg run. They said it was the most complete data submission they'd received from a non-professional team. She said, the King tech line told you that. He said, they were polite about it. She made the half-laugh, half-admission sound. The second year of the partnership produced 11 custom builds out of Harlan Fabrication, referred by Callaway locations across 3 states. Each build began with a terrain walk and a course analysis document. Each document was filed in a Write in the Rain notebook that Cody kept in the shop office on the shelf beside his father's notebooks, which he had inherited and kept because the job logs of 30 years were, as Ray had understood, part of the record of the work. June turned 11 in September and competed in 4 junior events that year, winning 3 of them and finishing second in the 4th after a mechanical issue in the rear differential that she diagnosed correctly at the course exit, and that Cody confirmed when she described it in the debrief. She had begun keeping her own Write in the Rain notebook. She noted terrain observations, set-up adjustments, and the specific decisions from each competitive run. She had written on the inside cover, in the careful handwriting of someone who understood that notebooks were records rather than drafts, Harlan Competition Notes, Volume 1. Volume 1 ran out of pages in November. The F-150 with the King coilover conversion competed at the following June's Fredericksburg rally and won by 14 minutes and 6 seconds, which was 2 minutes and 43 seconds wider than the previous year's margin. The course had not changed. The truck had. The driver had studied a full year of King coilover data from the 11 customer builds he had completed and had arrived at the Fredericksburg staging lane with an understanding of the suspension's behavior that was, he thought, the most complete he had ever had of any machine he had driven in competition. Renata was at the finish line. She had finished second in the B class in the Ram Power Wagon for the second consecutive year, which she regarded not with the deflation of losing, but with the specific motivation of someone who understood the gap between where she was and where she wanted to be and had a clear plan for closing it. She watched the F-150 come in. She watched June come off the running board with the composed expression of the co-navigator who had done her job and knew it. She said, 14 minutes. Cody said 6 seconds. She said, 14 minutes and 6 seconds. You improved by 2 minutes and 43 seconds from last year. He said, the King coilovers gave me the adjustability at the switchback. I took 3 additional seconds there that I left on the table last year. She said, what's next on the truck? He reached into the door pocket and produced the Write in the Rain notebook. He opened it to the page with the next phase list. She looked at it. She said, a limited slip differential. He said, Dana Spicer track loc for the Dana 44. The open differential is leaving time in the rock garden. I've measured it from the run data. She said, you measured time loss from the rock garden data. He said, the JPI equivalent for a suspension build is the GPS track log. I overlay the timing data on the course map after every run. You can see exactly where the wheel spin events are and how much time each one costs. She said, show me. He did on his phone the track log from that morning's run with the timing overlaid. She looked at it with the focused attention she had been giving his data since the first photograph on the diner table. She said, you built an analysis system for a $500 truck. He said, I built it for the build process. The truck is the ongoing proof of concept. She said, the truck is the platform. The methodology is what you're investing in. He looked at her. She had quoted him back to himself exactly. She said, I've been thinking about that sentence for 12 months. He said, what conclusion did you reach? She said, that it applies to more than trucks. She looked at him in the June afternoon of a hill country rally finish line, with the limestone hills around them and the cedar smell in the air, and June coming over from the timing board with a water bottle she had gotten from somewhere and was offering to both of them without being asked. And the F-150 sitting in the finish with its mismatched suspension components and its duply color lower doors and its hand-painted 47 that had been put there by a 7-year-old who had wanted to leave a record of when something began. Cody took the water bottle. He said, dinner is on me this year. She said, I know a better place than the pie company. June said, is it better pie? Renata said, it has better pie and better migas and a porch that looks at the Pedernales River. June said, I'll navigate. She opened the Write in the Rain notebook to a blank page. She wrote the name of the restaurant at the top in the careful handwriting of someone who had decided the record started here. Cody looked at his daughter, who was recording the evening's destination in a field notebook at a rally finish line because she did not recognize any version of life in which things that mattered were not written down. He looked at Renata, who was watching June with the expression that had replaced the staging lane laugh. Not its opposite, not guilt or apology, but something more useful, which was recognition. The recognition of a person who had updated completely and was no longer the person who had made the original assessment. He thought about his father on the shop stool in the last 11 months, saying the things he had been thinking for 3 decades. Don't confuse what you paid for something with what it's worth. The price you paid is history. The worth is what you decide to put into it from here. The truck had cost $512. It had been worth, in the 4 years of Sunday mornings and after hours work and careful notebook records, something that had no invoice line item. It had been worth the 14 miles run correctly. It had been worth June at the switchback calling terrain transitions in the voice of someone who had studied the map until the map was part of her. It had been worth this finish line and this afternoon and the river restaurant on the Pedernales and whatever came after it. It had been worth everything he had put into it. It always had been. He drove to the restaurant. June navigated. The hill country went past the windows in its June evening colors, the gold of the limestone, the dark of the cedar, the late light on the Pedernales when they reached it. He did not have the radio on. The truck was enough.